This is House Planning Help, episode 154. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and try to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is self-builder Jeremy Harris, and we're going to be discussing the challenges of building a new house in a rural community. This is actually one of two parts. The second part's on a different topic, which I'll tell you about next time. And I must say a big thank you to Hub member Corinne Mitchell for this one. She got in touch. She was a big fan of the eBuild forum, which sadly closed earlier this year. However, that's where she got to know Jeremy and follow the progress on his project, and then recommended it to me. So really excited about this episode. Remember that this podcast is driven by curiosity, so largely I explore topics that I feel I don't understand, but I have hundreds, if not thousands, of black spots, so your input is always welcome, whether it's topics, challenges you're facing, self-builders that you admire that you think I should get on to House Planning Help. I am up for it. Email me via the contact page at houseplanninghelp.com. Let's get into our featured interview with Jeremy then. One thing that really impressed me about him is his self-belief and just ability to say, yeah, I'm going to tackle this. He does have a background in science, which I'm sure helps. If I did this, I don't know where it would lead. We'll uncover this over 2 episodes. This first part, though, very much focusing on how it all came to be and this beautiful rural community where he ended up in Dorset. But some of the challenges when you come into that community and you want to build a brand new house and everything's been the same there for a long time, or there are very few new builds. So that's this discussion today. I started by asking Jeremy how long he's been wanting to build his own eco home.
It started around 10 or 12 years ago when we decided that we really wanted a low energy house for our retirement. I'd had a plan that I was going to retire early if I possibly could, and I wanted to use that time to design and build a house. So I persuaded my wife that a low energy house would be a good idea as a retirement home. The incentive for her was we could spend all the savings on holidays. So that was the driver. I think the hard part really was then looking for a plot. I started off looking at the type of house we wanted to build, which is the wrong way around. You actually have to start by looking for a plot of land and then determining what type of house will fit on that plot of land. So I went up this really steep learning curve of how you go about self-build. And there isn't much information about the Grand Designs programs and the other television programs and the magazines never really touch that beginning of the process, the finding a plot, the designing a house to fit that plot, the people you have to employ to do all that work for you. And it's really quite challenging to get your head around. At the same time, it's very, very expensive. We realized early on that we were going to be paying out many thousands of pounds to planning consultants, architects, building control, all these various people. And I started thinking, well, if I'm retired, surely it can't be that difficult. I'm a scientist by background. It can't be that hard to design a house. It's only a box at the end of the day. So we were originally going to employ an architect, but I'll come to that later. In the end, we didn't for a number of reasons. So I set out looking for a plot of land. And that is extremely hard in this country. We had a very wide radius. We didn't really want to be more than 2 to 3 hour drive away from my wife's parents, who at that time were living in West Sussex. And so really we looked at everywhere from the bottom end of South Wales, the lower end of Herefordshire, in one corner, over as far as the Wiltshire-Hampshire border to the east. And the only reason for not going any further was plots of land get far too expensive once you get into Hampshire. Down as far as North Cornwall, North Devon, South Devon, that sort of area. So in total, it probably drove several thousand miles looking at plots of land. Lots and lots of disappointment. There's lots of plots of land that look very, very nice when you see them on the websites, and you drive 100 miles and go and have a look at one, and it's nothing like in the photographs. So We had a lot of disappointments. We did find a plot of land in just on the Welsh-English border, right on the River Wye. That was our first plot, and we loved it. It was 3.5 acres, woodland, an old mill with a stream, absolutely fantastic. We made an offer, and that was accepted. And I decided I was going to employ a project manager because I didn't feel confident enough at managing, but I'd never managed building trades, only done DIY. And I went over there with the project manager, and he spotted that the boundaries were in the wrong position and the public footpath had been moved very, very quickly. Just got a tape out, and he said, the house that's approved on the plans isn't going to fit on this bit of land. So went and saw the local council in Newport and said, we've got this problem. They had a look at it. They sent their enforcement officer out who said, well, yeah, the footpath's been illegally moved 40 metres. And there are now 2 public footpaths, one that's by right of law that's on the definitive map, and one that's got a right in law because it's been in use for a number of years and has got footpath signs up that we put there. So he said, I immediately put an enforcement order on the land straight away. And a neighbour had nicked 40 metres of the land for their vegetable garden. So we did try hard. We really wanted the thing, but no matter what, we just couldn't build a house on there. There was insufficient space left. And the final nail in the coffin was that the local council said they couldn't even consider looking at a new planning application until the enforcement and footpaths problem was solved. And they estimated it would take them 2 years to sort out the legal position of the footpath. So we pulled away from that plot of land, and it's fair to say we were a bit disheartened. I'd spent a lot of money, driven around, and nothing. We then spent probably another year looking around at plots of land, even going as far as having holidays in places like North Cornwall and Devon, and even the Isle of Wight, to go and have a look at the lay of the land and see if we could find somewhere. Then by pure chance, we found a plot of land 16 miles away from where we currently lived. It had just come on the market. I drove over to have a look at it, expecting it to be a major disappointment, as they all are, or all had been up till then, and saw a very overgrown plot of land. It was approximately 10 foot high in brambles and trees and undergrowth, so you couldn't really see it. It was fenced. You couldn't get into it and walk on it. You could only just walk along the lane alongside it. But it looked as if it could be turned into exactly what we wanted. It had the right sort of aspect, so it faced south. So that meant that we could put lots of solar panels on and get the energy we needed. It was in a sheltered valley, so we had no exposed winds to deal with. So I went home and immediately started doing all the research.
Can you tell me the sort of research that you're doing? Because in this episode, we're wanting to find out, we know that this plot, there are quite a few challenges that we'll be talking through, and that would just be interesting to know your homework at home.
I think this is key. When you're buying a plot of land, it's not the same as buying a house. When you buy a house, you go to a solicitor does a load of searches. The searches come up with all the things in the old deeds and covenants, whatever, and you don't need to do any more than that. When you buy a plot of land, the work the solicitor does is of no value to you at all in terms of finding out the important things. The solicitor won't find out if you've got water, if you've got mains electricity, if you've got mains sewage. None of those things come up on any of the work a solicitor does. A solicitor will be able to tell you if there's something like a public footpath running through the land, but that's about it. The solicitor can't even tell you if the boundaries are in the right place. And boundaries are a really, really big problem with all building plots now. When the land registry came into being and compulsory land registration formed, one thing that happened was that they only put registered boundaries in place when houses changed hands, when they were sold. So plots of land don't have them as a rule, and almost all building plots have got their boundaries in the wrong place as far as the land registry are concerned, and sometimes seriously wrong. We heard of the first plot we we looked at where it was 40 metres out. This plot actually had a 5.5 metre boundary error, which meant that the house that was approved to go on it wouldn't fit. It was 1.5 metres of it would have been on land belonging to somebody else. So,
but they can't fix it.
Yeah, you can fix it, and there is a process of fixing it, and it's up to the vendor of the land to fix it. So you have to persuade them to spend money with the land registry to get the title plans amended. And it's not just the title plan to your plot of land, it's often the title plans to adjacent houses, which means involving their lenders and building societies, banks and whatever, because they obviously own, have a right on the title. So it gets quite complex to do this and quite time consuming. It took us a year between having our offer accepted on this plot of land and getting the boundary problem resolved. So that's an indication of how long it can take.
Are we up to 4 years now?
Yeah, we are. Yeah. It's about that time. And the other thing is that solicitors, when you go to buy a plot of land, they won't tell you about water and sewerage, as I said. And so it's up to you to ring the utility companies and ask them whether they can supply electricity. If you're on the gas grid, can they supply gas? Can they supply water? And actually, the answer to that will always be yes, because there's a statutory duty on the water companies to supply water. But the key here is at how much cost. And sewerage. Can they supply main sewage? They don't have to supply you a main sewage. That's not a statutory requirement. So in our case, electricity supply was easy. We had a electricity company come straight back and said, got plenty of power right on your doorstep. There's a phone wire right on your doorstep. That's easy. Just means a pole moving. The water company came back and said, yes, we can supply you with water. We will have to dig up a lane for a distance of 140 metres. And we did some haggling over costs because the part of the work can be done by anybody. Anybody with a licence can dig up the road and dig the trenches. Only the water company can make the connection. And so you have to shop around and get different prices to put the whole thing together. But the cheapest we could put the water supply in for was £24,500. Cheapest we could put main sewage in was £14,800. So lots of money. We hadn't bought the land at this point. This is still me doing the due diligence before you buy. We went back to the vendor and said, the price of the land is silly. I know that we're going to have to pay an awful lot of money to put the services in. It's why you've held on to it for 8 years and not been able to sell it. Let's do a deal. So we did a deal and we knocked a very substantial amount of money off the price. And then I set about looking at how we would resolve the water and sewage problem.
So really, was this a case of getting this plot because you were prepared to deal with something that other people might not have wanted? Yeah,
indeed it was. Yeah. It's exactly what it came down to. I mean, in the end, I spoke to the selling estate agent and explained the problems and said, if you think we're being awkward, this is the key issue. You cannot sell a plot of land with the boundaries in the wrong place, with no mains water supply. And the estate agent didn't know any of that. The vendor hadn't told the estate agent about any of those problems. And actually, he has a legal obligation to tell the estate agents that. So it gets very tricky.
I will share some of my experience of looking for land, but it does seem that a lot of these plots, as you go into it, you almost have to break down the gradual barriers to find these things. As you say, you have to work at it just to uncover, what have I really got here?
You do indeed. And our biggest stroke of luck was the boundary error, because the boundary error took so long to resolve legally with the land registry that it gave me a whole year to go into changing the plans for the house we wanted and modifying them, getting alternative ways of getting a water supply and providing drainage, finding the most cost-effective ways of doing those things. So we found, for example, that we could put a borehole in, that there was sufficient water under the ground. There were lots of boreholes locally, and a borehole was only going to cost about £12,000 complete, so half the cost of mains water. a sewage treatment plant was about £2,500 to buy, another 1,000 to install. Much, much cheaper than digging up the road. Perhaps most importantly, we didn't want to upset the neighbours. This plot had got a long and checkered planning history. All of the neighbours had objected to the building here, and it's covered in single track lane access all the way around. So any digging up of lanes was really going to inflame the situation with the neighbours before we even started. And that was the very last thing I wanted to do, was create more problems.
But you had planning permission. You were just trying to get planning for what you wanted.
Yes, we bought the plot with planning permission for a bungalow that we didn't want, a little stone bungalow. But I actually thought the principle has been approved by the local authority of putting a house on this plot of land. It was a 3-bedroom bungalow that was approved. We only wanted a 2-bedroom passive house. So the principle of development had been established. And that's a critical thing. Once the principle of development is established by an approval, it's extremely difficult for the planners to go back and remove it. Unless something in planning law changes or the local planning policy changes, they'd find it really hard to back off from that. However, having said that, we're in an area of outstanding natural beauty. We're in a conservation area. We're within a few metres of a Grade 2 listed building. And all of those things put constraints on what you can and cannot build. So, for example, all the external materials on this house had to be approved. But before we got to that stage, we had to actually get a new planning application together and in. So I went round looking for an architect and decided, they're the professionals at this. Let's go and find an architect. I wrote a brief of 8 key points we wanted in the house. Already had surveys of the land and the existing plans, and was immediately very disappointed with every architect I went to. None of them seemed to understand the concept of a low energy house. They would put things like skylights facing south into the roof, and you say, well, what about overheating? This is a super insulated, airtight house. And it was clear the architects just, the engineers will solve that. And there's this big divide in architecture, because architects are essentially artists, and their added value comes from their knowledge and artistry that they apply to the design. But they are essentially artists by training, and they don't normally do engineering work on houses. They don't design the beams and the structures and everything else as a rule. They chuck that over a fence to a structural engineer, and he has to solve the problem and make the house work. But with a low energy passive house, you've got to get that done in the initial design, because actually the shape of the house, the size of the windows, the orientation, the amount of shading over overhangs, over windows and things is vitally important. So they're all key design elements. So you have to find an architect who understands that. I know of one locally now, but I went round 4 architectural practices, got very disheartened, and then decided it can't be that hard. I'll do it myself.
Did you have to have a local architect, or did you consider someone from further afield, or was there something prohibiting that?
My personal view was that it would be easier to have somebody local, because they would be able to visit the site more often. Communications would be easier if I could see them face to face rather than email or over the phone. I could have gone further afield and found a passive house specialist, but I decided I'd do it myself. So I designed the house and went through about 4 iterations. And I have to say, I designed it during this year when we were waiting to buy the land because of the boundary dispute. It was a bit of an interesting conundrum. And my wife couldn't really get her head around the sizes and shapes of rooms. So I made some scale models at 50th scale with lift-off roof and whatever, so you could look inside and have a look at the rooms and where they fitted and whether the shower was big enough and was the bedroom big enough and was there enough space for all the furniture and various bits and pieces. And at the same time, having read all the previous planning applications, I realised it would be a good idea to do a scale model for the local population, the neighbours and the parish council, to enable them to have a look at what it might look like in the landscape. And in fact, that turned out to be probably the most important thing I did. I think the two most important things I did for planning were, one, talking to all of the neighbours a lot. I went round and saw every single neighbour, spoke to them all, sent them Christmas cards, sent them a newsletter every 3 or 4 weeks saying what we were doing, showed them the scale model before we put the planning application in, and went along to the parish council planning meeting, put the model down on the table. You're not allowed to talk to parish councillors. It's forbidden for applicants to talk. And then sort of kept our fingers crossed that we wouldn't get letters of objection which would push it to the planning committee. Because if the planning officer decides, then it is decided purely on the law and the planning policies for the area. If a planning committee decides, then I'm afraid to say emotions come into play far more than planning law, and councillors tend not to want to upset those that have elected them. So they tend to want to side with the objectors very often. So that gets to be very difficult.
Is it just objecting against change, really, or was there a specific thing that they didn't want?
I think some of it was objecting against change, but all of the neighbours I spoke to had serious complaints, had genuine concerns. I mean, one was concerned that we were going to overload the sewage system. The sewage system apparently is pretty much at capacity. And I managed to say to her, well, we're not actually using the sewage system. We're putting a treatment plant in and discharging clean water into the brook. So we're not affecting this. Oh, well, I don't have any objections at all if that's what you're doing. So 2 or 3 of them had objections to the height of the house. Because they couldn't understand that it was going to be set into a hole dug out of a hillside. They can't read the plans very well. You know, people have a problem, I think, in trying to think in 3D when they're looking at plans. So they took one look at the scale model and said, well, it's going to be cut 3 meters down into the ground. Oh, no, that's fine. That's not going to be a problem. And we were worried about it was going to completely block our view, or it was going to cast a shadow over our garden or whatever. One neighbour had a worry about a window in the end of the house being able to see into their back garden. And, I was able to show by the model and say, well, we won't be able to see your back garden at all because my garage will be in the way because we're setting it down into the ground. And she took one look at it and she said, oh, no, that's great. She said, that's going to help my garden because the wind won't blow my vegetables out. If you put your garage there, then that's going to block the wind that whistles down this valley and my vegetables will do better. Oh, no, that's great. I'm all in favour of that, she said. And so that was a case of, we had several cases where objectors turned to supporters simply because they hadn't really understood what it was. So I think engaging with local people is important, with the caveat that you have to be a little cautious and not give in too much, because you can get the odd person, and we had one, who once you give in one thing, they start asking you to do a bit more and a bit more and a bit more, and before you know where you are, you're spending an awful lot of money and you have to just put your foot down. So that's the only caveat I'd say, is that by all means engage the neighbours, but it's your house at the end of the day. Is your plot of land. They're going to have to live with what you built. And it will be perhaps not what they would like to live in themselves. So we managed to get through the planning stage with no letters of objection at all, which is remarkable because the previous application had 14 objections at parish council level and dozens of letters. And of course, the number of letters of objection, if it's more than 7 in this area, that automatically triggers it going to the planning committee. So by not having all those objections, we didn't go to planning committee. We had to wait the 6-week consultation period out. And then at the end of that, planning officer rang me up just before Christmas and said, consultation period's over. I have no problem at all with what you're doing. I'm really excited with it. It's a very exciting looking house. We've never had a house like that before. I'm going to recommend approval. I just thought I'd let you know before Christmas. It won't be signed off till after Christmas because the chief planning officer's on holiday and he has to sign the thing off, but I can assure you that by the middle of January it will be signed off, which it was. So then we had to go around and find a builder.
Just before we round things off, because I think this is quite interesting to have talked about this, and we'll dig deeper into the whole story at another time. But I'm wondering whether are there any other things when you're building in a rural area that you need to bear in mind, other tips that you found along the way?
I think the main one is making sure that services are going to be available. Services in rural areas are often stretched to the limit. Lots of small villages have already been expanded as far as things like the telephone network, the electricity supply, sewage system, even the water system will allow. So I think they're the main ones, is get onto the utility companies and really pin them down. Some of the utility companies are not terribly good at giving you detail. A good example is BT Openreach. Worst company in the world to deal with because they don't deal with the general public. They sell services. So when you're building a self-build, you are a developer as far as Openreach are concerned. And they have carte blanche to charge you what they will to put a new phone connection in. If there isn't enough capacity, they'll just charge £100,000 for a new multi-cable, and you just get the bill. That's the sort of attitude you have if you can get hold of somebody in Openreach. So I think you do have to do an awful lot more homework and not just assume you can get these things. I was very lucky here. Because Openreach is so difficult to get hold of, and I needed a pole moved, which was actually an electricity pole, but it had a phone cable on it. I couldn't find anyone to talk to. There are no phone numbers for Openreach because they're a communication company and they don't like talking to people. So, it's no joke. They deliberately set it up so you can't talk to them. I eventually found the mobile phone number for the local engineer, who turned out to be an absolute gem. He was a super bloke called Nigel, and I'm indebted to him because he was just a hard-working chap with a lot of common sense. And when I said what I want to do, he said, that's going to improve our needs. That's going to make my job a lot easier. He said, if we can make all the network around you underground, if you can put ducts in for us, we'll give you the cable and ducts for free. We'll do it all for free. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, overhead cables down here are a nightmare for us. He said, all these trees and things. He said, do that. And so he did. He gave me loads of free cable and ducts. And because I was already digging trenches everywhere else, it cost virtually nothing to load those in. And it got rid of all the overhead cables on site, which was a bonus for me and a bonus for him.
Well, Jeremy, let's stop there and we'll hear the story of your proper self-build, not just as we have in many situations, the contractors coming in and doing the whole lot. You are actually doing a lot of this work yourself. So if we're okay, we can catch up next time about that.
I'm more than happy to talk to you next time about that, yeah.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session at houseplanninghelp.com/154. You can review the key points. There are photos of Jeremy's plot. And if you have a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can do that at the bottom of the show notes. houseplanninghelp.com/154. Let's finish on a hub update, and we've added another video to the Buckinghamshire Passive House story. This is a country house that's being built with the Passive House Homes PH15 timber frame system. Janet Cottrell, part of Passive House Homes, also the project architect on this particular house and author of the Passive House Handbook. So it's great to have her as our guide, stacked up with experience. We had a recent podcast episode with her, if you haven't heard that. This latest video, though, is about the excavation work, preparing for the Glatar basement. That's fully Passive House certified. I believe there aren't many, if any, other choices if you want a fully Passive House certified system. And of course, it has all the necessary waterproofing and things that you need when you go down into the ground. I'm chatting with Nick Tompkins from Precision Groundworks in this video. We talk about ground investigation reports and how that helps him, how jobs range in complexity, and tips for keeping the costs down. That all in the latest video in the hub. We've had another progress call as well. If you don't know about these, very much like a conference call. We're keen to up these next year so that they are monthly because they're really useful, and it's amazing the information that we're finding out. Plus, We haven't even switched on the video side yet, when we can start sharing designs and discovering how projects have been put together. So at the moment, they're just audio calls. All this and more in the hub. And currently enrollment is now closed. That window of opportunity will open again in the new year at some point. So make sure you put your name down on the VIP early bird list so that you'll discover all about the next enrollment period. houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time we hear part 2 of the interview with Jeremy Harris, and in it we discuss his decision not to use an architect or designer. How did that pan out for him? We'll find out next time. Cheers for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.